blood smells like copper and old pennies. But hospital politics smell like recycled air, passive aggression, and someone's God complex marinating in surgical scrub. I know both well enough to tell them apart in the dark. I have told them apart in the dark, in places where getting it wrong was the kind of mistake you only made once. My name is Elena Voss. On paper, I am a float nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Bakersfield, California. I am 41 years old. I have a scar that runs along the inside of my left forearm that I tell people came from a bike accident in college, and a knee that forecasts rain more reliably than any meteorologist west of the Rockies. I take a shift wherever the charge nurse needs a warm body. I do not complain. I do not ask for favors. I do not talk about myself. They thought I was just another temp filling a gap. Then 4 Special Forces soldiers came through the doors of Mercy General, looking for someone they called Ghost Actual, and nobody in that hospital had any idea who they were talking about. Let me tell you how we got there. I had been at Mercy General for 11 days when the shift that changed everything began. I was assigned to the surgical prep floor, busy without being interesting, exactly the kind of work I preferred. Controlled, predictable, nothing that would require me to become more than the sum of my paperwork. The floor smelled the way all hospital floors smell. Antiseptic fighting a losing battle against human biology. Beneath it, the faint institutional undertone of cafeteria coffee that had been sitting on a burner since before I arrived. The fluorescent lights didn't buzz. They hummed, a low, abrasive frequency that burrowed behind your eyes somewhere around hour 4 and didn't leave until you were in your car with the windows down. To the civilian staff, the surgical floor at 7 in the morning was controlled chaos. To me, it was a waiting room. I moved from bay to bay with what my supervisor had described in my paperwork as efficient and uncommunicative. That was fair. I cataloged the exits when I walked in. 2 sets of fire doors, 1 service elevator, 1 external stairwell visible from the east window. Not because I thought I would need them, but because I no longer knew how not to. 11 years is a long time. Some habits do not unlearn themselves just because you change your clothes. The surgical prep nurse I was covering for had left her IV cart in the wrong place. The patient in Bay 6, Mr. Arthur Delgado, 72, veteran, hip replacement scheduled for 9, was lying with his call light out of reach and his water cup empty. I refilled the water first. I moved the cart second. I checked his chart and noticed someone had failed to flag a potential interaction between his blood pressure medication and the anesthesia protocol. I flagged it. I did not make a show of it. Mr. Delgado watched me work. He had the kind of eyes that had seen enough to recognize stillness in other people. "You military?" he asked. I did not look up from his chart. "Float nurse," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "My granddaughter's a float nurse. She doesn't move like that." I smiled at his chart. I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. I arranged the supplies in his cart the way I had arranged supplies in 100 forward surgical units. Everything where your hands could find it without looking. Every sharp object capped and oriented the same way. Nothing loose. Nothing wasted. I did it without thinking. That was the problem with muscle memory. You could not decide when to stop using it. Chief Surgeon Dr. Harrison Weld arrived at 7:43, and the floor reorganized itself around him the way planets organize around a star, not by choice, but by gravitational law. He was 60, silver-haired, walked with the specific authority of a man who had not waited for anything in 20 years. His cologne reached Bay 6 before he did, something expensive and forceful that immediately narrowed my sinuses. His white coat was crisp in the way only a coat that someone else launders can be crisp. He acknowledged the charge nurse with a nod and addressed everyone else through her, the way people address hotel staff through the concierge. He did not notice me until I was in his way. I was standing at the medication cart outside Bay 3, cross-referencing Mr. Delgado's flagged interaction with the attending's anesthesia order. I had found a discrepancy. I was noting it in the chart when Weld came around the corner and stopped. "Who are you?" he said. "Elena Voss, float nurse, surgical prep. I'm covering for..." "I didn't ask what you were covering. I asked who you are." He looked at me the way a person looks at a piece of furniture that has been moved to an inconvenient place. "You're not on my approved staff list. I was assigned through the agency this morning. I flagged a potential medication interaction in Bay 6, Delgado, hip replacement, 9 o'clock. The anesthesia protocol lists metoprolol, and the pre-op sedation dosage may need to be adjusted." Weld looked at the charge nurse, whose name was Patricia, and whose expression suggested she was already bracing for something. "Patricia," he said, "is it standard procedure now to allow temp staff to annotate surgical charts unsupervised?" "Dr. Weld, I barely pay the agency to send me a warm body." He looked at me directly, and his voice carried across the entire prep floor the way a man's voice carries when he wants it to carry. "You are a glorified inventory clerk. You do not touch my charts. You do not flag my protocols. You straighten beds, and you restock shelves, and you stay out of rooms where real medicine is being practiced." He picked up Mr. Delgado's chart, scanned it for exactly 4 seconds, and set it back down. "The anesthesia protocol is correct. The interaction you've noted is clinically irrelevant. Anyone with actual surgical training would know that." He walked past me without waiting for a response. I looked at the chart. The interaction was not clinically irrelevant. The dosage notation was wrong. I knew it, and in 45 minutes, the anesthesiologist was going to know it too, but she would catch it herself, and the record would not reflect that a float nurse had seen it first, and that was fine. That was the entire point. "He does that to everyone," Patricia said quietly, coming to stand beside me. She was trying to be kind. "Don't take it personally." "I don't," I said, and I meant it. You don't take a job as a float nurse if you have an ego. You take it because you want to be invisible. You take it because you have spent 11 years being the most visible person in rooms where visibility meant a targeting reticule. And you are tired down to the marrow, and you want, more than anything, to be someone that nobody looks twice at. I went back to restocking the cart. In the break room at 9:15, I poured the coffee that had been on the burner since approximately the Reagan administration and stood at the window that looked out over the parking structure. A resident whose name I had not learned was eating a granola bar with the mechanical focus of a person running on 3 hours of sleep. I thought about Kandahar. I did not mean to. I never meant to. But there was a smell from the autoclave down the hall that was close enough to the smell of a forward surgical unit in Kandahar province in 2017 that my body registered it before my brain could intercept the signal. I had a piece of shrapnel in my left knee that the orthopedic surgeon at Walter Reed had left rather than risk the nerve cluster it was resting against. On days when the barometric pressure dropped, it announced itself. Today was not one of those days, which meant today was a good day, and I was going to count it as one. I had taken this job to be invisible. I had taken this job because the alternative, a real position, a full caseload, a name on a door, required becoming a person other people paid attention to. And I had not figured out how to be that person again yet. At 10:40, Dr. Weld returned to the floor and stopped in the doorway of Bay 6 long enough to notice that Mr. Delgado's procedure had been delayed by 40 minutes. What happened to my 9 o'clock? he said. The charge nurse explained that the anesthesiologist had identified a medication interaction in the pre-op protocol and needed time to adjust the dosage. Weld's jaw moved in a way that communicated the specific displeasure of a man who has just been shown he was wrong and is determining how to frame it as someone else's fault. His eyes landed on me. The temp nurse submitted a chart annotation this morning, Patricia said carefully. It was already flagged internally, Weld said. No outside input was necessary. He looked at me directly. If your agency sends you back to this floor, do not touch charts, do not annotate protocols, and do not interact with my surgical patients unsupervised. Clear? Clear, I said. He walked into Bay 6, and I went to the supply closet and stood in the cool quiet. Mr. Delgado had served in Vietnam. He had come in this morning with clean boots, and his dog tags tucked under his gown. He had asked me if I was military because he had seen the way I moved, and I had deflected. And still there was something in his eyes, that patient, waiting kind of recognition that stayed with me longer than it should have. This was not my problem. This was not my war. In 12 days I would move to the next assignment, and none of these people would remember my name. I was so tired. It wasn't the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The vibration didn't start in the air. It started in the soles of my feet. It was 11:22, and I was in the medication room initialing a supply transfer, and the vibration came up through the linoleum and the concrete beneath it in a frequency I had not felt in 6 years, but recognized in the first half second, the way you recognize the voice of someone you grew up with. Heavy, rhythmic, rotor wash. Not a medevac. The acoustic signature was wrong. Lower, heavier, a particular thud-thud-thud that communicated mass and military modification. I put the pen down. My hands made the decision before I did. Does anyone hear that? The resident said from the doorway. I heard MH-60M Blackhawks, 2 of them, maybe 3, descending toward this building. Not landing on the roof helipad. What I was feeling in the floor told me they were heavier than the helipad was rated to take, and the parking structure was the only adjacent surface with sufficient load capacity. Then, someone's phone lit up with an alert. Then another. Then the floor PA crackled to life with the administrator's voice. Incoming emergency transfer. Military personnel. All available trauma staff to the ER. Stat. The civilian staff reacted the way civilian staff reacts to the word military in an emergency context, with excitement and fear that in a trauma setting translates to bodies moving without a clear direction. I pressed my back against the wall of the medication room. Not here, I thought. Not my problem. I am a float nurse. I am just here to restock the shelves. My hands were in my scrub pockets. I could feel my own pulse in my palms. Through the window at the end of the hallway, I watched a Black Hawk drop below the roofline and disappear behind the parking structure. Then another. The floor shuddered. Somewhere below us, in the trauma bay, I could hear the sound of the building holding its breath. Doctor. Weld's voice reached me from the stairwell before his face did. He was on his phone. And he was not pleased, and when he came through the fire door and looked at the gathered prep floor staff, his expression said that whatever was coming, it was not his area, and he was going to make that clear to everyone. I need all non-essential staff in the corridors, he said. We have an incoming military casualty. ER trauma team is taking lead. He looked at the float nurse standing against the medication room wall. You, he said, pointing at me. Basement, supply run, trauma card inventory before Eid. Patricia looked at me. I looked at Patricia. I looked at my hands. Now, Weld said. Yes, doctor, I said. And I went to the elevator and pressed B, and the doors closed. And I stood in the descending cage listening to the sound coming up through the shaft from the parking structure, rotors spinning down, boots on concrete, the kind of controlled, organized movement that sounds completely different from a civilian emergency response. And I put my back against the elevator wall and pressed my palms flat against it and said, out loud, quietly, to no one, no. You left. You are out. This is not yours anymore. The elevator reached the basement. I stood there. From somewhere above me, through 2 floors of concrete and steel, I heard the flat, sharp sound of a cardiac monitor going to 0. I stood there for 17 more seconds. I know it was 17 because I counted. Then, I pressed the button for the first floor. I heard them before the elevator doors opened. Not the rotors. Those had spun down. I heard the entry. I heard the specific sound of tactical boots on hospital linoleum, which is different from the sound of civilians running because it is faster and does not decelerate at obstacles. I heard a voice saying clear left and another saying hold perimeter, and above all of it, a voice I did not recognize, demanding something of someone in a tone that did not expect to be refused. The elevator doors opened on a hallway that had been transformed. 4 soldiers in full kit had established a perimeter at the ER corridor junction. They were not Army medical. They were special forces. I clocked the unit patch in the first second, the equipment loadout in the second. One of them assessed me in a quarter second and returned his eyes to the corridor. I was a nurse in scrubs. I was not what they were looking for. They were looking for someone. The automatic doors at the end of the corridor had jammed open, and through the gap I could see the trauma bay. Dr. Weld was visible, gesturing, his voice raised at a military officer who was not listening to him. The officer was scanning the room, moving his eyes from face to face with the systematic focus of a person executing a search pattern. I am the chief of surgery at this hospital, Weld was saying. I have the authority to. You have the authority over your staff, the officer said, without looking at Weld. Not over mine. Get out of my way. He was tall, early 50s, the kind of lean that comes from decades of specific physical discipline. His rank insignia said Lieutenant Colonel. His eyes kept moving. Behind him, a gurney came through the ER doors from the parking structure, and on it was a man in tactical gear with a chest wound I had identified from 20 feet away as a tension pneumothorax before the gurney reached the trauma bay. I knew what that was. I knew what it required, and I knew that if the civilian trauma team was not already doing it, the patient had approximately 4 minutes. I watched through the gap in the doors. The trauma resident was doing the right things in the wrong order. The attending was calling for imaging. Nobody had a needle in their hand. The lieutenant colonel turned from the trauma bay doorway, and his eyes swept the corridor. They passed over the soldiers. They passed over Patricia, who had come down from the floor. They passed over 2 orderlies and a security guard and a candy striper who had no business being in this hallway. He said one word. Ghost actual. Not a question. A statement made in the direction of a room, because the room will answer. I had not heard that name in 6 years. Not since a firebase in Helmand Province in 2019, where I had decided, in a moment of complete clarity, that I was done. That there was a version of Elena Voss who got to exist in a hospital in Bakersfield and flag medication interactions, and drink terrible coffee, and not be the person who stood between people and the worst possible version of the next 5 minutes. I was standing near the isolation supply cart. I was the only person in the corridor who did not turn to find the source of the name. The lieutenant colonel's eyes came back. They found the stillness. They found me. He took 1 step forward. He looked directly at me. I looked at my hands. Then I looked at him. Something behind my sternum shifted. like a lock turning over that had been corroded shut. I had not given it permission. It did not ask. I pushed off the wall. I walked past the lieutenant colonel without stopping. I did not rush. My knee did not bother me. It always bothered me on hospital floors, and it was not bothering me now. I was aware that my posture had changed. Something that had been held at a specific compression had released. I was 2 inches taller than I had been against the wall, and it was not a decision I had made. I pushed through the trauma bay doors. The resident looked up. The attending looked up. Weld, who had come in from the other side, looked up. "Move," I said to the resident. My voice was different, not louder, colder and more precise, the way a scalpel is more precise than a kitchen knife, not because it is sharper, but because it knows exactly what it is for. The resident moved. "She's not qualified to," Weld began. "I need a 14-gauge needle. 10 centimeters. 30 seconds ago," I said to the attending, and she reached for the supply cart before she had consciously decided to, because the tone alone accomplished it. That tone had been developed in places where the alternative to being obeyed immediately was a body bag. I put my hands on the patient. They were not shaking. They had not shaken since the moment I pushed off the wall. They found what they needed: the second intercostal space, right side, mid-clavicular line, the way hands find things they have found 1,000 times before, in the dark, in the dirt, in conditions that made this fluorescent-lit trauma bay look like a spa. "I'm not ghost actual anymore," I said, and I don't know who I was saying it to. Maybe myself. But I know how to do this. I found the landmark by feel. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right side of the chest. I had done it in Kandahar in 2017 in a forward surgical unit, with a needle improvised from what we had on hand. I had done it in a Humvee in Helmand in 2019, with a medic talking me through the radio because he had taken a round and couldn't use his right hand. Right now, the only thing in the world that mattered was the specific geography of this man's chest and the pressure differential that was killing him. The needle went in. The sound it made, a soft, controlled release, a hiss of pressure equalizing, was the same sound it always made. The monitors responded in 4 seconds. 5 seconds. The attending, who had been reaching for the wrong intervention, went quiet. The patient's blood pressure stabilized. His oxygen saturation began to climb. Around me, the chaos had gone still. The monitors were still running. The lieutenant colonel was at the door. 2 of his soldiers had come inside without anyone stopping them. But still, the way a room goes still when it has just witnessed something it cannot immediately categorize. The attending was looking at her hands, then at mine. My hands were not shaking. They moved to the secondary assessment with the economy of motion I had not used in 6 years, cataloging, confirming, communicating findings in the precise clipped language that my corpsman, Sjeet, Darius Webb, had taught me to use when there was no time for qualifiers. Darius was in San Diego now, working in a VA clinic. I thought of him, briefly and completely, in the way you think of people whose knowledge lives in your hands. "He's going to need a chest tube," I said to the attending. "I can walk you through it if you need me to." "No," she said quietly. "No, I've got it." She did. She was a good doctor. She had just needed the first step taken. I stepped back from the gurney. The lieutenant colonel had not moved from the doorway. He was watching me. "She moved the way people move when the stakes are real," he said to no one in particular. It was not praise. It was recognition. It landed the way a hand on the shoulder lands after a long time in the field. Not dramatic. Not sentimental. Just true. His name was Elt Call, Marcus Rios. and he read from a tablet his sergeant handed him in the trauma bay doorway, while Dr. Weld stood 6 feet away and the prep floor staff had gathered in the corridor, and Mr. Delgado, who had come down from surgical prep in a wheelchair, because no one had thought to stop him, sat near the door with his dog tags visible over his gown. Staff Sergeant Alina Voss, Rios said. 18 Delta. Special Forces Medical Sergeant. Attached to 3rd Special Forces Group, Kandahar Province, 2015 to 2017. Helmand Province, 2017 to 2019. Meritorious Service Medal. Bronze Star with Valor. He looked up briefly. For action at Firebase Zulu in 2018, in which Sergeant Voss performed emergency battlefield medicine under direct enemy fire and preserved the lives of 9 Special Forces soldiers, including 2 who would not have survived evacuation. He lowered the tablet. The call sign Ghost Actual was designated after Firebase Zulu. She earned it for being the last person standing in a surgical position that everyone else had evacuated. The room was quiet. I was looking at the wall. Because the wall did not require anything from me, and right now everything else in the room did. She separated from service in 2020, Rios continued. Medically retired. We've been aware of her civilian location for approximately 2 years. We don't ask Ghost Actual to come back. We respect her choices. But when Sergeant First Class Harlan's transport went down 40 minutes from a hospital that had her in it, we made a different calculation. Dr. Weld had not moved. His face had done something complicated. The specific expression that arrogance makes when the architecture it was built on has just been removed from underneath it. He had no expression that covered what he had just learned. Elt, Call, Rios turned to face the doorway. He came to attention. He raised his hand to his brow. The 3 soldiers behind him came to attention at the same second. 1 motion. 4 salutes. The sound of their gear during the salute was brief and specific. Soft adjustment of equipment. The pop of fabric. And then, silence. I looked at the 4 of them. I brought my right hand up. It was not an emotional action. It was a procedural one. It does not matter that you are in scrubs instead of a uniform, and it does not matter that there are tears on Patricia's face, and it does not matter that Mr. Delgado, in his wheelchair by the door, has pressed his right hand over his dog tags and closed his eyes. You return the salute. I held it for a 3 count. I brought my hand down. In the corner of the room, the young resident, the granola bar one, the one running on 3 hours of sleep, put both hands over her mouth. The paperwork took an hour. The administrator came. Risk management came. Weld left before either of them arrived, and Patricia told me later he had submitted a formal review of his conduct with the department chair before end of day. Conscience or self-preservation. And I did not spend energy deciding which. Sergeant First Class Harlan was transported to a higher-level facility 40 minutes later. Stable, breathing on his own. His team went with him. Rios was the last to go. He stopped at the door of the trauma bay. We won't stop knowing where you are, he said. I know, I said. But we won't call unless we have to. I know that too. He nodded once. The nod of a man who understands when a conversation has said everything it needs to say. Then, he left. Mr. Delgado's procedure had been rescheduled for 2 o'clock. I went back upstairs to make sure his cart was in order. He was lying in Bay 6 when I came in, dog tags resting on his chest, eyes on the ceiling. He heard me and turned his head. Float nurse, he said. Float nurse, I agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Thank you for your service, Sergeant Voss. I looked at his supply cart. Everything was where it needed to be. I opened the top drawer and neatly arranged the masks inside, closed it, checked his water, his IV line, his vitals on the monitor. "You too, Mr. Delgado," I said. "Get some rest before your 2 o'clock." I left the bay. The fluorescent lights hummed their low abrasive hum. My knee did not hurt. The coffee in the break room was going to be terrible. I still had 4 hours left on my shift. If Ghost Actual's story stayed with you today, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel. We tell the stories of quiet heroes who never asked for recognition and never needed it. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one reaches.